Colbert is Executive Director of the Grassroots Community Organization Group Cohesion Network. Mr. Colbert led the second Black Lives Matter movement protest in Allentown on 4 June 2020.
Just a correction, that was led by Vic LaBoy, Actiontown activist.
I realized that Vic LaBoy actually organized it.
Yeah, he organized it. I worked with him.
Yes, right, yeah. Well, I appreciate your humility. At this very peaceful yet impassioned protest during the days following the May 25th slaying of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis, Mr. Colbert spoke, and in his speech drew a virtual connection, well, actually a literal connection between the library in Allentown, the Allentown Public Library, and the Lehigh County Prison, making a literal line between education and mass incarceration, symbolizing the specific Black Lives Matter protest against the infamous school to prison pipeline. Mr. Colbert has also spoken at virtual town hall meetings with allied public police officers, such as Police Chief Glenn Granitz Jr. and other police officers who marched down Hamilton Street in support of the June 4th Black Lives Matter protest. Welcome, Darian Colbert.
Thank you.
Michael Ralph is Professor of Anthropology and Africana Studies at New York University. Dr. Ralph was W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute Fellow at Harvard University in 2018, an annual Michel Rolfe-Trouillot Lecturer for the Department of Anthropology at University of Chicago. Michael Ralph's list of research and postdoctoral fellowships is too long for me to enumerate here, but Dr. Ralph's two recent books are Forensics of Capital, in which he argues that any social profile of a country or of an individual is, quote, a credit profile as well as a forensics profile, unquote. In another book, Dr. Ralph performs a kind of archaeology of U.S. insurance companies that have provided marine insurance, life insurance, and at one time slave insurance for Americans, and introduces new insights. Dr. Ralph, that is in his book, which is called Life, introduces new insights about the connections between ownership, debt, property, and embodiment. Welcome, Dr. Ralph.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I think maybe we'll have each of you just go ahead and say what you'd like us to know about your work more specifically. And throughout the proceedings today, I think it's safe to just open up the floor to anybody that has a question. Please type it into the chat and I will be keeping an eye on that. So I'll give the floor over now to Dr. Ralph and Mr. Colbert.
And so I think just to kind of give everyone an overview of what's going to happen during our time here today, the first kind of half of this conversation or part time, I'm going to just explain my background and then walk you through my time at Northampton County Jail and some creative solutions. And then after that, Mike's going to close us out. We're talking about so many of the creative things he's working on right now. And then I believe we're going to leave some time for a Q&R, question and response. I like to use question and response because answers acts like we're like the end all be all know it all. And that is not the case with Mike and myself. We both consider it a privilege to be participating in the Peace and Social Justice Conference. So to Ken Burrock, thank you so much. Mike Logan, thank you for involving the two of us. And so I'm going to explain my background so we can jump in. And so I'm an Allentonian. You know, I went to elementary, middle, and high school there. I graduated from Deerhoff in 1989. Shanta graduated in 1990, so I'm actually a year older than her. And so I think talking about my background, I think it's important to kind of show you, to build a bridge from, I want to say we're talking about the prison industrial complex, but to build a bridge from the school to prison pipeline and what that looks like for me and my own understanding and some of the different things I've done researching these things. And so when you look at school now, most schools in the Lehigh Valley have a officer in the middle schools and high schools, right? And so I'm 49. There were no officers in my middle school, Harrison Moore, or my high school, Louis C. Deerhoff. And here's what I want to say. If there were officers in the building then, I probably would have a background. And that's part of the system that I believe is broken now because things happen in middle school and marginalized communities, and things happen in high school. And so guess what? I would have been a part of this system. I would have a background. I'll be one of the millions of people that struggle to get a job based on your background. So I kind of want to build a bridge there just to let you know that the school to prison pipeline really is something like we talked about from the library that represents education. We walk straight down Hamilton Street, right, representing gentrification. And then we get to the prison, which represents mass incarceration, right? And think about that for a moment, right? And so who benefits from all of that when you look at the gentrification and all that other things? And so when you look at this school to prison pipeline, it also goes to budgets, right? So you look at what they put into marginalized districts, it's not a lot of money because it's based on scoring. And so this system is so intertwined together, but we're not here to talk about that. But I want to just build a bridge from the school to prison pipeline and how it works with the prison industrial complex. And so for the last 23 years, I've been working with young people. That's what I've done. I've been working with young people and working with them, mentoring, coaching, and doing all types of different things with young people. And which leads me to a point I did want to make since Mike Logan was introducing me, like I led the second protest. What Justin Fields Parker and Vic LaBoy did for me was there was this awakening that happened for me as a 49-year-old Black man. And so they had the courage to go out and do a protest. And I showed up at Justin's and said, hey, how can I serve? How can I help? And then I reached out to Vic and said, hey, how can I help? How can I serve you? And really what these two gentlemen did, man, they just gave me the privilege of kind of helping me on my liberation journey, because I have not arrived, but I am on my way, you know? And so I do want to give just a special shout out to Vic LaBoy, Justin Fields Parker, Arthur Benson, Ryan Velasquez, Alex Colon, Yamalisa Tavares, Ashley Strange. These are people who are now part of my tribe, my community, and I want to give a special shout out to them. I also want to make mention, I want to say their names. I want to say Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And really, these three people for me have allowed us to start this social justice revolution for people of color. So I do want to give a shout out to them as well, because their deaths will not be in vain. So no matter who's president in November, we will continue this because we understand this is the marathon. So I know I need to stop and get into the prison industrial complex. And so I'll simply start off by saying I had the wonderful privilege to be a LEAP instructor / case manager inside of Northampton County Jail. I did it for 3.5 years. My last day was November 29th of 2019. And what LEAP means is linking employment activities pre-release. It was, so after 13 was released and all this research about prison population, people started talking about recidivism, right? So LEAP was a recidivism program and it was funded by the federal government for the first 19 months. And in 19 months, we had to prove that if you focus in on this, job readiness and character education, that it will have impact. I can tell you to this day, this is one of the most impactful jobs that I've ever had and most powerful spaces I've ever been in. And I know Mike spent some time in prison, so I know he can say it. And also I heard you this morning, Mike, you also did that. And so, you know, it's a powerful, powerful space. And so when we looked at Northampton County Jail, many prisons across this country applied to get a federal grant. 22 actually got the grant. Northampton County was one of them that secured the grant. And so in 2016, we began this process. And so within 19 months, the program showed that the recidivism rate was 46.6% if you did participate in our program. Our stats showed that if they participated in our program, it went down to 27.6. And if you take out petty violations, you were looking at 5-6% recidivism rate. And so it was huge. That's huge. So we made a difference. The county actually then said, hey, we'll fund that program. It's working. And they still fund this program till today, which is really powerful. And one of the things we focused on when we were in the jail is so many people think, just get them jobs, and just do this and just do that. But there's so much more to helping people who are involved in the prison industrial complex. And so what we had this saying, before we can build a resume with them, we have to build them back up. And so our first week with them, we had a 5-week program. Our first week with them was simply building them back up and reminding them who they really, really are. And at our orientation, we kind of highlighted the program. And at all of our orientations, every time we started the class, at our orientations, here's what would happen. People, clients, men and women would realize, oh, I'm going to feel this one. right? I'm just not going to casually, because some people took the class just to get off the block. I'm going just to get off the block. I heard this is animated dude down there who's really hype, and I want to, and so they said, I'm just doing this to get off the block. And one of the guys that was in our class, man, at orientation, I was just sharing, hey, what the next 5 weeks is going to look like. And he had this big diesel beard, and he grabs his beard, and he said, yo, this SHIT is real. And he's like, oh my goodness, because even in that moment, as we were talking, we were connecting, right? And this connection happened. He grabbed his beard and was like, wow, and he yelled, this is real. And I was like, wow. And that's one of those moments just in orientation. Had other orientations where I had clients sitting right next to me, class packed, and I could tell, I could look at them and see, oh, they won't be back. Because I was like, oh, no, I can't do this. Because the one guy that sat next to me that didn't come back was like, he was holding back crying because for the first time in a long time, he was actually feeling some of the stuff. And I think sometimes we always have this quote, pain that doesn't get transformed gets transferred. We say that. These are some of the quotes we tell them. Pain that does not get transformed gets transferred. Now, it's unreasonable to think that in 5 weeks, we're going to really deal with all the trauma that people have shared with us, right? But a really good start is language. Language, what they say. Many of my clients would say, hey, I'm a criminal. I'm a felon. And I would say, no, you're not. And you can't use that language in my class. You committed a felony act. You committed a criminal act. You are a human and a person first. So stop labeling yourselves. Your words are powerful. Studies show it takes 7 positive words to cancel out 1 negative word. So you got to be careful the words that you speak over yourself or that you allow other people to speak over you. So we say language is huge. So from the very first day, we give the rules of engagement and really calling yourself a name or other people's names. You cannot do that in that special space. And so that's what we start working on. And really, when you think about building them up, we do personality assessments with them, some fun ones, right, to help them understand when they're feeling secure, these are the behaviors that they have. When they're insecure, these are the behaviors that they have. And then we kind of dig deeper into who they are as a person. And really, we talk about their values, what they care about as a person. And that sets the tone for the rest of the 4 weeks. And literally, if people aren't interested in the program within the first 3 days, they stop coming. But in our program, that was the rarity. People stayed, which made the program so powerful. Some of the things I like to highlight is success stories, right? So some of the people that participated in our program, right, became my peers. So they were in class with me, and then they became my peers, people who I had to call for help as I was working with my clients. And I still do that to this day. So I'm gonna tell you a story about a young lady who was on A2 West in Northampton County Jail. And I went up, I did all the recruitment, education, and follow-up. So when they left, we got a chance to follow up with them once they left. For a year, we got to walk with them. So I go up to the unit, and the CEO says, hey, she's upstairs. You can go visit her up in her cell. So I go upstairs and I'm saying, hey, my name is so-and-so. Oh, she goes, oh, you that leap dude? Hold on, I'm coming right down. She came down off the top bunk and she gets in my face and she goes, I got a job, okay? And she goes into this wonderful exhortation about how many jobs she has and that she's an amazing employee. And I said, looked at her and said, oh, so you're not interested in the program? She goes, I got a job. I said, I'll take that as a no. Peace, I'm out. And so I left. 1 month I come back and I'm going up there for recruitment. And I go and I say, hey, I need to see so-and-so and so-and-so. And 2 young ladies came up to me and said, hey, I'm in your class, but she wants to join the class. I said, okay, what's your name? And she goes, I talked to you before. And I looked at her, I said, well, I don't remember talking with you. And she just looks at me and goes, I got a job, person. And I'm like, oh, that's you. And she goes, yes. She goes, I want to join the program. I said, well, what happened? She goes, I got released and I got some additional charges and I got myself in a lot of trouble. And I really need to refocus. And many people up here telling me I can refocus in this program. She was, I'm telling you, amazing in class. She not only did 1 resume, she did 3 resumes because she has 3 different kind of careers. And she did 3 resumes. And I said, hey, you can work them together because there's some commonality. Nope, she wanted 3 different resumes, focused. She got out of the program, she did well. And now she's actually a supervisor at a treatment center in the Lehigh Valley. And I had to call her last week and ask her for help. I'm sorry, I had to call her and ask her for help with one of my clients I was working on the outside. I said, hey, he doesn't want to go to a rehab around here. What are your recommendations? And basically, she gave me some recommendations up in the Pocono area. And that's kind of a story about how a person kind of who was in my class became a peer. And that's happened multiple times over. I have another person I call when I need some help. And so that's a wonderful thing about this LEAP program. When you engage people and connect with them like that, I always like to say is you provide them with something that they're lacking in that moment. And I like to say it's hope. When people enter into that system, man, they come hopeless, struggling, and all we simply do is provide some hope. And how do we provide hope? By saying, hey, take in the mirror, this is who you are. You're an amazing person, but you have to believe that. And I always like to say hope is a resource for people. And in that small space in that classroom there, all we did is exchange hope together. And guess what? Sometimes I needed it, or my other facilitator, Sam, needed it. You know what I mean? So it kind of went around. Why? Because hope is a resource. And it doesn't matter whether you're in prison or you're in prison, you still need some encouragement sometimes. And so those are some of the different stories that I'd like to share. I'd also like to highlight addiction is a real issue. And so we lost a lot of our, I wouldn't say a lot, but we probably lost over a dozen of our clients due to addiction. And we had a guy who was in our class, and I always have this saying, wherever you go, there you are. So no matter where you go, you can't run from how you feel and your problems. And so we had a client of ours, a young man who decided, I'm moving to California. He moved to California with a friend. He thought he would be safe from his addiction. And he came back to be buried locally here because he lost his battle to addiction over kind of in California. And I'm like, those are some of the stories that we had to deal with. And let me tell you something right now. Every time we lost one of our clients, man, I was devastated. And they knew how to prepare me. Hey, either tell Darren on his way to work or tell him when he's not about to go into a class. Because when you connect with people like that, we're all humans, right? You make that connection, right? You feel it when something crazy happens. And so I just kind of wanted to share that. And I do want to pause because I know I'm talking fast because I know time is limited. Does anyone have a question or thoughts before I continue? So I don't want to keep going and just assume that no one has anything to say or question.
Well, we got plenty of time, Mr. Colbert.
Okay, cool.
I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any questions. So, yes, please continue.
Awesome. So also during my time at the jail, Northampton County Jail, man, it was really, really amazing. And I think one of the things that I thought was super important is for our clients, because prisons in our country mostly made up of people of color. So it's important that they see people of color in positions besides CEOs and other things of that nature. So here I am as an educator, job readiness and character education. And I remember walking through the flats. Now the flats are one of the oldest parts of Northampton County Jail. And sometimes people say things to you, but I heard this guy, he was screaming at the top of his lungs from the top, and he was saying, "Black man." And I had to go up to the director's office, then come back down. When I came back down again, he was still yelling it, but he was yelling it. And I just kept walking, but he kept yelling, "Black man, look up here, look up here." And I just, how you kind of feel that. I think he has something to say. So I looked up at him and he goes, "When I get out of here, I want to be just like you." And I just looked at him and I said, "You can be whatever you want to be, man, when you get out of here. Just got to put that work in, brother." He said, "Okay." And I went back to my office. And I'm not telling you that story because it's like, oh, he wanted to be like me. I'm telling you that story because for him, I represented hope. In that small space, when he saw me walk through there, I represented hope. I represented, wow, I can do something. Like that's what I represented. You know what I mean? Because this hopelessness in that jail is for real. And so all I did is represent hope to this young man. Another story, I'm working with a client who I work with in the class. And think about this. He's told me his dream was to join the military and to be a chef. But obviously, he has some felony charges. So we have to work with that. And so I was working with him while I was in the jail, made some calls, and they said they would work with him. Long story short, and I'll talk about this a little later, parole and probation, petty violations, get some wrapped back up in the system. And now it's been put on hold for about a year and change now. He reaches out to me and says, "Hey, I need help." And so I start helping him. I started calling recruiters a couple of weeks ago. And I give him his name and his information. And when they see his record, they just never minded. So I called some recruiters and they just never minded him. And so, but we kept pushing. He kept pushing. We kept pushing. We finally he gets a call. "Hey, I need 3 letters of recommendation and we're going to move this forward." And so now potentially he's going to join the military, which is his dream job, to join the military and serve his country. That's his dream job. And so all I simply did is help him connect some dots. And even though I'm no longer there, one of the most impactful jobs I've ever done, because that's what our organization is. Right. So all I did on Monday is write him a recommendation letter and email it to him so he can give it to someone up that or his officer so they can send that paper away for it all to be approved. That's a wonderful privilege to be able to write some recommend letter and thinking about this, that could have been me. If the system back in the 80s was different, that could have easily been me. And so now I'm gonna kind of build a bridge from him. Petty violations stopped him for about a year and a half from entering into the service. And a lot of my clients, when they tell me, they feel trapped and entangled in this web of probation and parole. And I would ask them, what's a petty violation? Police contact. I said, what does that mean? You did something wrong? He goes, no. If I'm with my friend, he got a speeding ticket, they pull me over, the officer can take me to prison because that's police contact. You know, if I get into art, like, so there's so many different things that can, if I test positive for marijuana, if I do so many things that for petty violations. And so some of my clients would come back in on a petty violation, or some of them simply would say, hey, D, I got 48 hours to pay $148. I said, how? You got to get a job first. They don't care. It is what it is. I have 48 hours once I'm released from this jail to come up with $148. Now I want you to think about that. For people in marginalized communities here, and I had clients tell me, well, D, I got really one option because I don't have family support like a lot of people. It's to grab that package from my man, turn that over real quick, and pay that fine. And that's what some of my clients have to tell me. And I'm like, oh, no, don't do that. And he goes, and he always say, D, it's easy for you to say, but if I don't pay that $140, I'm coming back up in here. And I am not coming back up in here. You know, and so those are some of the options for people. And people think that's only $148. Well, that's a whole lot of money for people getting out of prison that don't have any family support. So I kind of want to say, so that whole process needs to be just kind of looked at and refreshed, I would like to say. And also, Pennsylvania did this wonderful thing. They did, if you were on the run and you didn't get in trouble with the law and you walked away from a halfway house or some kind of rehab and there you had a warrant, Pennsylvania said, I think it was, if you turned yourself in before September 4th, and it was basically you didn't get in any trouble and you literally left a halfway house or a rehab center, they said they would throw away your tail and give you a fresh start. I listened to this story out of Pennsylvania that someone in Harrisburg sent me, and it was about a guy. He said he was on paper since he was 13 years old. He's in his 30s, since he was 13. And so the guy interviewed him and said, well, what happened? He said, well, I was on a bus. I got into a fight because a bully bullied me every day. At the end of the year, I said, I'm done. So I fought him. And I got put on probation, and I've been on probation ever since then. He actually interviewed the dude coming out, exonerated, that there's no more tail. And he goes, this is the first time since I'm 13, I'm 30-something, that I have been off paper. Now think about that for a moment. So when I use this word entanglement or this cycle, it is a cycle for some people because once they get involved in that system, man, it's just like this never-ending petty violations, this and that. And then I also know a young man who got in trouble as a juvenile. And here's the deal. They said that this will come into play in your adulthood so before he turned 25, if he committed another crime, they would bring his juvenile record back into play. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. He did something when he was 13. They said, okay, you do this probation bit, but if you do anything before you turn 25, we're bringing all of your charges then back into play. And then that's going to be your score. And everyone has a gravity score, they call it. And then that's how you be. Now think about that. That's just wrong. As a teenager, 13, made a decision, and literally he had to be good until he was 25. And if he did anything within that realm, they would bring his juvenile record back into play. So I'm going to close out my time. I talked about a lot of the issues and problems, but now I'm going to talk about some solutions, right? And so I didn't really address addictions, mental health, and homelessness, but I'm going to provide you a solution at the end for some of those things. So solutions, budgets or value statements. We spend on one person who's incarcerated, $40,000 on that one person. We spend $8,000 on a student. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. $40,000 on one person who was incarcerated in a year, $8,000 on a student. That just seems, if you think budgets or value statements, right? And that's just crazy to me. And so I like looking at it like this. While people are in prison, they work for 20 cents a day sometimes, and all these crazy numbers that they do. I would advocate creative solutions, right? For allowing them to work, but get paid a normal wage, minimum wage, right? and give some of that to them, and some of that go back to the community, especially since Black and brown people are affected by this prison industrial complex more than anybody. Man, I'm telling you, put it into marginalized districts who really, because of test scores, get the bottom of the barrel types of money, right? So my whole solution is, as they're working in prison, let them work for themselves to gain money so they can pay off some fines, put some money kind of in a bank. So when they have a $148 fine they have to pay in 48 hours, they can say, oh, I'm leaving with $1,000. So pay the minimum wage because they're doing a job anyway, right? Rather than, because that's, I mean, I'm not even gonna get into my thoughts about prison labor, but I'm gonna leave it right there, that why don't you pay them minimum wage? Because they work hard. When you look at the kitchen crew, you look at, they work really, really hard. So pay them. And you could just take parts of their money, put it into districts in the area and into themselves. So that's a creative solution. My last thing I'm gonna close out with, this solution means something to me, right? Because addiction, mental health, and homelessness is all connected. It is all connected. And most of my clients either had addiction issues or some mental health issues, right? And so state hospitals in Pennsylvania were shut down years ago. And so guess what happens with people who have mental health issues? They no longer go to a state hospital. They go to jail. So people who have mental health issues, so they emptied out our state hospital, and all that did is, and those people kind of entered into the prison system. Not automatically, but over time. And so my whole idea is this: we have a state hospital in Allentown, right on Hanover Avenue, a huge facility. Man, you could wipe out our homeless population. You can deal with mental health and addiction issues by simply opening up that entire facility to house people who wrestle with addiction, mental health, and homelessness, and put them on a program. And you put case managers and people, and you bring all these other organizations that are working these social justice platforms, put them together and have them helping out at those state grounds. And I'm telling you right now, we will have an impact in the Valley, and we will take the people in Tent City and Allentown. We can eliminate that entire population and put them in a state hospital. Now, I know Mike, you know, there are some people that don't want that. They want to do what they want to do. I get that. But there are a lot of people that do want the help. And so think about a creative solution is simply this: to use that state hospital locally to do that for addiction, people who wrestle with addiction, mental health, and homelessness. And I'll close out simply saying this. I truly believe in a movement of we. And I am committed to a movement of we. And you know why I'm committed to a movement of we? Because if you think about it like this, all of us on this call, no matter what color you are, no matter what age you are, we all have a piece of the answer. I truly believe that. Every single one of us has a piece of the answer. So that means that our solutions will only come from our togetherness. I'll say that again. Every single one of us on this call right now has a piece of the answer. That means our solutions will only come from our togetherness. And that's my small part in this. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mike Ralph.
Yeah, thank you very much, Darian. You've made an amazing case for the interconnectedness of poverty and trauma and addiction and mental illness and incarceration and homelessness. And I really appreciate what you said in your closing remark there about the need for togetherness and to undo the enemy making, if you will, that just seems so pervasive in the U.S. these days. And it seems to me that Dr. Michael Ralph probably has a lot of thoughts in his head right at this moment after listening to you speak about all these different things, especially things that have to do with the sort of monetary value placed on bodies and incarcerated bodies in the U.S. prison system. So, Dr. Ralph, I'm going to give the floor over to you now.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Michael. Thank you, Ken, for the invitation, and thank you, Darian, for just being so thoughtful and nuanced in your analysis and detailed in your explanations about so many of these dynamics. Like, as you were talking, I could relate to a lot of what you're saying, and I learned a lot from what you're saying, and I've learned a lot from just speaking with you and working with you in preparation for this panel. And a couple of things jump out to me. You know, I've taught a bit at Shawangunk Maximum Security Facility, and I taught a course at Wallkill. But at Shawangunk, you know, I was there as part of a conversation on race and politics once, and you know, I was there with another professor who was kind of showing a picture of Soledad O'Brien and trying to talk about race and difference and multiculturalism in America. she was like, well, what background do you think she is? And some people were like, oh, she looks biracial. Some people were like, that's Soledad O'Brien. And the professor was like, what do you make of race in the US, or race? And some people were like, well, race is used to foster inequality. There's a lot of racism in America. It's the heart of America. Some people were like, I think of race as a social construct. I think class is more important than race. They're saying all these things. One guy said, I just feel like ever since Linnaeus, people have been put in these taxonomies. And I was like, wait a second. Linnaeus is like an 18th century philosopher who's known for like creating these taxonomies of species like plants and animals and different kind of types of human beings. And I was so struck by the fact that this guy was like invoking Linnaeus. Like he sounded like one of the doctoral students at NYU or something like that. And later I found out the guy who was talking about Linnaeus was regarded as the kind of most well-read person in Shangunk, in this maximum security facility, and also that he had been doing like the most time, So he was in one level kind of like the most feared or revered person, but also the most respected intellectual. And I started thinking a lot about this relationship between people who are sort of respected, and also people are kind of aware of what they've done, where they might have done some very serious crime at some point in time, but often decades before, and they've done like a life sentence, a double life sentence, something like that. And I was thinking about, why is it that the guy who's doing the most time is so smart? And it occurred to me all of a sudden, and something, if you're in prison education, you see this, that, oh, he might have done this thing like 40 years before. But for 40 years or for many decades, he's mainly just been a scholar, right? Essentially. So he is like someone who's, studied a PhD and or was a professor or something like that, in the sense that, he spent most of his time reading and thinking and debating. The other thing that struck me about that experience in particular was that at Shangunk, even more so than at Wallkill, which is minimum security, was that like how diplomatic they were. Even in debate and conversation, they'd be like, I appreciate your point, and I understand what you're trying to say. I just want to add one thing to that. They'd be like, okay, well, I recognize where you're going with this. I just want to caution you against this. I was like, I was so struck by even how sophisticated the engagement was with each other. And I asked people about this, like, yo, people are so diplomatic, so thoughtful, so polite, and they're like, yeah, because, it could be a problem. You step on someone's toes, offend someone, you don't want to do that, And I just thought like, wow, like so many of my colleagues could learn so much about how these classrooms operate, how they're conducted. Researchers and scholars I work with can learn so much from the research and insights being produced here. I guess the thing I was struck by, I think I've always been struck by in doing prison education and things like that, is that, people talk about prisons and how dangerous they are and how dilapidated they are and all that. And that's true, of course, in many ways. But I guess the most alarming thing to me was how familiar it was the first time I walked into a prison, especially in maximum security, in the sense that, I walked in, a guy's like mopping the floor, and he could have been any of my cousins or a friend or something like that. And everybody was so polite and friendly and casual. And it's like, that was the alarming thing. It's like, okay, if these people really seem dangerous and scary and all that, okay, of course you'd be like, okay, it's a good thing they're locked up. But people seem so kind and humane and insightful and thoughtful and generous. Then you're like, well, what's going on? Like, how is it that these people who are clearly capable of this research and this kindness and all these things, are locked away? And I think this is like, I guess, a key thing for this panel. The other thing I think that's important, Darian touched on it, and I want to come back to it in a second, is just, I often think that essentially in much of the work I'm doing, especially the creative work around incarceration, one of the most important takeaways is that ingenuity can't be incarcerated, So like insight, intelligence, ingenuity cannot be incarcerated. And I think that, when we see the scholarship, we see the artistry, we see all these things coming out of prisons, it's because they can't be incarcerated. Like human beings are capable of so much, and they will exercise their imaginations and show what they're capable of no matter what you try to do to them. And so what we're finding when we go into these prisons is that, oh, there's all this art and scholarship and insight and even engineering ability and entrepreneurial ability, all these things that we see because people are capable of that, and they will continue to express that no matter what you try to do to them or no matter what kind of constraints you put on them. I want to talk a little bit about like some of the research I've done and how I came to some of the work I've been doing and some of the insights. So I'm going to share my screen. 1 second, I'm going to see if I can share this PowerPoint. So actually, a lot of my work in prison started from work I was doing on insurance that Michael mentioned. I guess, my training is as an anthropologist. I have a doctorate in anthropology. My research is kind of at the intersection of medical, political, and economic anthropology, or sort of medical anthropology, politics, and finance. And, I was doing research on just different ways that people assess monetary value of a human life And I've taught I teach a course at the School of Medicine at NYU, and also the same course I taught at Wallkill Correctional Facility called Value of Life. And it's just looking at the different ways people assign monetary value to human life, from accident compensation to insurance policies to federal regulations designed to save lives and things like that. And I'll tell you a quick story. I taught this course at Wallkill, and I've given this exercise both at NYU Medical School and at Wallkill, where I'll start the first class, I'll give them like a list of atrocities, and it'll be like, Boston Marathon bombing, Virginia Tech massacre, 9/11, Deepwater Horizon, all kinds of things. And then it'll be the event, the atrocity, then the list of casualties, and then the amount of compensation. And it's all scrambled, and you have to try to mix it, And it's very hard to do, obviously, because sometimes I feel like there's no rhyme or reason why in this atrocity victims got this amount versus that amount. Of course, transatlantic slave trade, people are yet to get reparations, So there are various levels of compensation and numbers of those injured, And it's like an impossible exercise, but when I taught it at Wallkill, this guy got all of them right, And it was so interesting to talk to him afterwards about like how he got all of them right. And he was like, well, this one was students, they wouldn't get as much money. This one was this one was that. And he had this really sophisticated like sort of way of accounting for like how you distribute value and harm and things like that. And I was like really trying to get this dude to do like a PhD in econ or something like that. Because I was like, he's so good at this, right? Even more so than like my graduate students, the students in the med school. And that's just like obviously an example of just how brilliant people can be. And, as Darian was saying, when you look at the recidivism rates, both in the kind of program that he's been working with, but also more broadly with education, you see that it kind of drops in half the more someone does education, right? So if they do a course in prison, it drops a lot. If they do an AA degree, BA degree, and if they do a master's, it drops to 0. So that's especially astonishing that if someone who's formerly incarcerated goes on to do master's, the recidivism rate drops to 0%. So this is a project, this is a website I built called Treasury of Weary Souls, which just looks at the way people were insured, enslaved people were insured. And interestingly, when enslaved people were insured, it really started a lot after 1808 because the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, but slavery was still legal. So people who wanted enslaved workers couldn't bring them into the country legally. So they wanted to rent them from people who already had slaves in large numbers. And what you notice is, you think about slavery and plantation slaves, but really the people who were insured were usually slaves who were rented out to businesses or to other plantations, and they were usually skilled, highly skilled. So I have like a breakdown of what skills they did. I'll go through this quickly before I get to some of the work I'm doing. But like there were either like people who managed households, like servants and cooks. They were either artisans, like you can see the vast array of artisans, or they worked in really dangerous, really lucrative industries. And when you look at this list, you start to realize that what we think of as slavery was in many ways like the origin of the U.S. working class, that these people who were enslaved, who we dismiss as just kind of treat them as livestock or as brute, just like, unskilled labor, had all kinds of range of skills. And that's precisely what made them valuable and what made them, but that made their owners take out insurance policies on them. Because if you're going to rent out an enslaved person who's like a baker or a skilled carpenter, and that person dies in someone else's care, you want to recover the value of your asset. So the insurance records sort of reveal just how highly valued and how much appreciation there was in the marketplace for their expertise. And so so this is like a part of the table I used when I was constructing this site. But to build the site, I actually worked with this group, Resilient Coders in Boston. And what they do is take people who are formerly incarcerated and often, I guess at-risk young people and prepare them for jobs in the tech sector. So it was a pleasure working with them, and they built this amazing site. So you can just go to treasuryofwearysouls.com and see it. And, that it's interesting that there's all kinds of discrimination, obviously, against people who are formerly incarcerated. But interestingly, in the tech sector, truly, where there's just a focus on someone's skills, there's sometimes a tendency to overlook that, just be focused on someone's coding ability or something like that. So that's interesting. In addition to that, while building the site, I sort of realized that I had these records from Kentucky, and I couldn't explain like why their occupation wasn't listed. And I wound up doing archival research in Kentucky and found that a lot of them worked in hemp. And then I found this memo from this prison warden written to the governor of Kentucky, where he said he didn't want to produce hemp in the prison anymore, even though it had been the biggest source of revenue in the prison for like 30 years. And I thought, oh, this is strange, because I saw that enslaved people worked in hemp, but why are they doing hemp in the prison? And then I discovered that there's this guy, Joel Scott, who in 1825 introduced hemp farming into the prison. it had only been done by enslaved people until that point. And so this is sort of like the origin of, I would argue, like convict leasing, but it's several decades even before the 13th Amendment. And people talk about the 13th Amendment as this site where, oh, people wanted to continue slavery through the criminal justice system. But here's an example in Kentucky where, what's happening decades before the 13th Amendment even passed, which to me suggests that the 13th Amendment has that language that you can't be enslaved unless you're first convicted of a crime, not because that's when it started, but because that was one of the ways they realized you could continue this, because in some sense it had already been happening in Kentucky. And the deep part about it is that it was a prison full of white people in Kentucky where this was happening, And so I think about this a lot in terms of the current political landscape, because we hear stories about, people who are poorly educated, exploited over the generations in the Rust Belt. And a lot of those people sort of wound up voting for Trump in 2016. And when we hear that, it's surprising because we think of mass incarceration, we think of people of color, African Americans, but there are groups of white people, in particular in Appalachian and Kentucky, who have been historically exploited over generations. And of course, it's not the fault of like racial minorities or underrepresented people, but it is also true that they've been excluded and heavily exploited over the generations. And that's one of the things we have to be attentive to. And when you look at like criminal arrest records and statistics, you see if you take out Latinx people and African Americans, the Appalachian whites become like the racial minority. They're the ones that have disproportionate arrest and incarceration rates. And so I think this is very important to think about just how race and geography work to kind of create these cycles of inequality over generations. And I won't take too much more time because I love to go to Q&A, but I want to mention a couple other projects. So one of the projects is a graphic book project that's based on this research in Kentucky and convict leasing. And I'm doing a book called Before 13th, which has Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells kind of narrate this story. And I chose them because Ida B. Wells, well, the book actually starts with a kind of feud they had where they were both protesting the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. Well, they initially agreed to boycott it, and then later Frederick Douglass was invited to speak, and Ida B. Wells was upset that he didn't participate in the boycott. So she did this edited volume kind of protesting it, and then he wound up speaking, but they kind of patched it up afterwards. But they both were concerned by the fact that this 1893 Chicago World Fair was basically trying to showcase American ingenuity and commercial supremacy and military might at a time when, 30 years removed from slavery, or not even, a lot of African Americans were still essentially in a condition analogous to slavery, and a lot of social problems in the U.S. that were trying to be covered up by this kind of showcase of American ingenuity and things like that. And then another project I've been working on is called Fishing. It's both a short animated film and a graphic book project. And this project started with actually something that my students were talking about, and even staff who were formerly incarcerated were talking about fishing, and how people who were incarcerated were like tearing up bed sheets or using thread from their clothes and tying it to objects and sharing objects with each other. And I was just struck again by the ingenuity. And I would say, like, the theme of fishing is that ingenuity can't be incarcerated, as I was suggesting before. And as even Darian's stories attest to this. And interesting, when I was doing this film, I thought, okay, I'll just use sounds and music to do the narration. There won't be dialogue. And so when I was doing the book, there wasn't text. It was just sort of like, images doing the storytelling. And when I would show it to publishers and agents and things like that, they were like, well, if a book doesn't have text, it's basically a picture book, and you can't have a picture book about incarceration because picture books are for kids and incarceration is too serious a topic. And then if it's for adults and older people, it needs text and things like that. But I was thinking a lot about this idea that you can't do books about incarceration for young people. And of course, I looked it up, and there are a few books about incarceration for young people, but there are books about helping someone cope with the fact that a parent is incarcerated. The first book of this kind of thing was actually a bunny rabbit having to deal with his dad being in jail. And then there are other books like that, but they're always in this vein. But there aren't really books like sophisticated storytelling about incarceration for younger audiences. And this is strange because obviously because of mass incarceration, we have people, thousands and thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been affected by mass incarceration. And obviously young people do grow up visiting relatives or not being able to visit or see relatives and trying to grapple with why, so I think it's unfortunate but interesting to try to make these kind of interventions into the kinds of stories being told about incarceration. And toward the end, I sort of want to just close by talking about two projects I worked on. Oh, actually, no. One thing first. I had the good fortune to connect with this animation studio that was really excited initially about my project, and was gonna even charge me less than they normally would charge like a major corporation or a Hollywood studio to do this animation. And I had done these storyboards and these images, like one you see here about incarceration, and sort of telling the story of fishing. Like they're kind of trying to, in a subtle way, hide their materials and try to share stuff with each other after, without the guards knowing and things like that. And when I sent them my storyboards in the image like this is what they sent back to me of their director's vision of what the prison looked like. And it's just, I don't even know. I couldn't even put into words how distressed I was by this being the animation studio's rendition of it, And, when I was talking to them, they were like, well, just tell the guy what you want and he can do it. I was like, no, but like everything from the color to the expressions to, it's just, and they just were clueless about what I was trying to say. And that made me realize that what they, what you see on the one side here, to them, that is somehow how people who are incarcerated look, like almost animalistic, like moronic, like it's just really distressing, But I guess, again, it shows how important it can be to try to work in some of these other genres, because obviously things like animation and books, picture books, affect a lot of people's lives. And I once saw this stat that like maybe like 80% of picture books for kids feature like white subjects, maybe like 8% of them are like Black subjects, and like 5% are like Latinx subjects or a few Asian subjects. But most most were like, besides white subjects, were robots or animals, and then a very few percentage for other underrepresented groups, So all that to say, this is what you deal with when you work with other genres and things like that. But obviously the work is still important. And so I had the good fortune to work with Reflect Media. They had a project where they're working with people who are incarcerated to tell their stories about being locked up in the age of COVID. And so this guy had written a poem, Jermaine Glenn had written a poem about being locked up during COVID. And he and I worked with another animator, Angie Ria, to bring his story to life. And then the other project I worked with was we called it Study and Struggle. Garrett Felber and a lot of activists and organizers in Mississippi, we put together a kind of inside outside prison education, political education project, and also did some kind of like short kind of like zines to explain books, like I did with Lee Gilmore's Golden Gulag and things like that. So these projects to me are really important, obviously, because they give us an opportunity to connect with the activists on the ground and scholars and people incarcerated and sort of share insights. We learn from them, they learn from us, and we learn from each other in much of the way sort of Darian was talking about. So I'll stop there so we have plenty of time for Q&A. But, it's an honor to be on this panel. I'm really excited and invigorated by, my colleagues and comrades here, and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ralph. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing that a publisher would shoot down the idea that incarceration is not appropriate for children when, oh, excuse me, but here's just a simple fact. 80% of women incarcerated in Pennsylvania are mothers. 80%. So, for every 10 women incarcerated in Pennsylvania, 8 of them are mothers. There are at least that many children out there, who would benefit from seeing a book like the one that you have in mind. It also kind of struck me that, and I know it's really maddening to see the way that the characters were distorted and dehumanized in the second version of the two men in the cell. The one brushing his teeth and the other sitting on the bed. But I couldn't help noticing that also the guard out in the hallway in the second version was represented as being like superhumanly fit and athletic and large and threatening compared to one in the first. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much, so I want.
Can I say something before we go?
Absolutely,
forward? That's something
yeah.
that triggered a thought.
Go ahead.
I go into the school district, so I think about this for a moment. I would teach character education and job readiness in the prison and leave there and go teach character education in the Allentown School District to elementary, middle, and high schools. Mm-hmm. And we do this exercise. We step up to the line. Now, Allentown is a marginalized district, right? So all the schools we've been to, we do the step up to the line activity on week 3. And one of the questions is, if you have a family member who's affected by, if you have a family member who's incarcerated, step to the line. And I'm telling you, almost every person steps to the line, including me, right? And so when you do that, so you talk about the effects of that, right? And so when you say, oh, I don't want kids knowing about books, well, who are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, because the reality is, almost every kid. I don't think I ever remember one school that we've done where not almost everyone stepped to the line. I think it was one school or two schools or one person. Like out of the longest time I've been, one person didn't or two people didn't step to the line. But think about that for a moment. So they have family members who were incarcerated. So this is something that we should be talking about. But I also want to say this: when I looked at your picture, Dr. Ralph, man, that cell looks spacious. Now I go recruiting, and I had not seen a cell that big unless there's 12 people up in that piece. Excuse me. What I mean by up in that piece is up in that space, right? And so the cells that I usually go into, there's 4 beds, and it is tiny. 4 adult men, 1 toilet, and it is small and tiny. So that picture, when I looked at your picture, I was like, wow, I'm sure cats in North Carolina County Jail would like to be in that cell. And then when you look at the other cell, which is way darker, it still looks a little spacious. I also want to say cells are not that big. Cells are actually pretty small, at least in Northampton County Jail that I kind of visit, unless you have 12 people sitting in there. So those are some of the things I wanted to say, but I am going to turn it over just in case people have questions. So I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please just go ahead and verbalize them now. We have about 20 more minutes for these questions to happen. You may also write them into the chat if that's more comfortable for you. Ken says, Michael, I'd love to hear more about your case that in slavery, we see the origins of the working class.
Yeah, that's the question. So I think it's really important that, I think what I would say about slavery is sort of similar to maybe what we can say about incarceration, in the sense that when people are fighting against it, the tendency by abolitionists is to describe how horrific it is and how people are reduced to the status of like animals. Like abolitionists talk about like cages, people in cages. And I understand why, because that language is powerful and it's gripping and it makes people sort of want to transform that condition. But I think we have to take a step back and say, well, since generations of African Americans have been enslaved, and then generations of African Americans were imprisoned, those sites became so important for so many things, actually, right? Like intellectual formation, political training and awareness, learning skills. Like, Darren and I both do prison education, but we also are aware of the fact that people are learning a lot from each other and learning a lot inside they can later take with them outside, and unfortunately not always being recognized. But the artists and sculptors, like if I told people stories of things I've heard, it's mind-blowing. Like I've heard stories about guys who like had a bag of potato chips, crushed up the potato chips, added some water, turned it into like a dough, rolled it out, made a pizza. I heard about the guys who like would boil Jolly Ranchers down until they melted and make like flowers that look like blown glass flowers with Jolly Ranchers, or somebody who could make a rose with toilet paper and then use a marker and color it, and it looks like a real rose sitting in a florist shop. So it's like there's so much happening with skills. And so in terms of the working class, I would say a person's political or legal standing does not evacuate their expertise and their possibilities, right? So we think about the working class like free people working in a factory or something like that. And then we think later they migrate into other domains, but even enslaved people were trained and learned skills as artisans, were clerks and drivers and barbers and butlers and chefs and things like that. And so I just said that when we think of the history of working class, we should think both about even people who were enslaved who acquired those skills, and also people who were, free quote unquote workers, but heavily exploited. Like I could give you a really interesting contradiction. Like there were places in Virginia, like coal mines, where you had enslaved workers and free workers working side by side. And the enslaved workers are legally property. So let's say the mine, it blows up, it explodes, and there's like 45 enslaved workers and 5 free white workers. They might only publish the names of the free white workers in the newspaper and say, these 5 white workers, their names, and these 45 enslaved people died, 45 slaves died. But an enslaved person might even be the foreman of the mine, so the most skilled miner, and the slaves might be insured. So to the owner, the lives of the enslaved people might matter more than the white workers, because they might make a profit off when they die. So there's this weird contradiction between race and legal standing and value, where one group is heavily, like highly valued, but not recognized in the eyes of the law. The other group is recognized in the eyes of the law, but not highly valued monetarily, and both are exploited. So I just think that in the history of working class or history of sort of capitalism or capital in the U.S., we have to think through these contradictions without making too many easy assumptions about how they play out.
That's really interesting. It's as though there's a divide racially between, not so much between who has value or who is able to work or who is valuable to the company, but along some other lines that have to do with some abstract notion of who is owned and who is
Right,
not, who is
right,
free and who is not.
right.
And I would even say something to the effect of who has a soul and who
Mhm.
does not.
Right.
You-
Yes, and I think different people can be valuable to a company or to a country in different ways, right? Like one of the things I also worked on and thought a lot about, and that's sort of tied to slavery, and I would argue as its origin slavery is like some people have discovered that the company they work for has a life insurance policy on their life, and they weren't aware of that, you know. And then you say, well, a life insurance policy is supposed to, the beneficiary is supposed to be next of kin, like someone in your family, like your children or your spouse, your partner or something. How could it be that your employer has a policy on you? But as it turns out, you can only have a policy on someone else if you have an insurable interest. And in some states, an employer-employee relationship is recognized as insurable interest. So your employer could make the claim that, oh, that um, they have a vested interest in your life, therefore they can take out a policy on you. The best example of this, or the kind of most sterling example, or one of the most sterling examples, is Rick Perry, former U.S. presidential candidate and governor of Texas. He had proposed taking out insurance policies on public school teachers in Texas, saying that essentially the state had an insurable interest in public school teachers, and therefore when they died, the state would generate revenue from the value of their lives. And that idea got shot down, but he was working with this Swiss financial firm UBS to do this program. And so the idea that he could do it, like have the idea and it be legal, just reveals to you that there's this whole kind of calculus and monetary value of people's lives, and the idea that other people should benefit from the value of some people's lives, you know. And there are many examples we could discuss, but that's just like one.
That's fascinating. I'm going to scroll up to James L., who has a more or less straightforward question for you, Dr. Ralph. It is, do you feel that since the beginning of mass incarceration has its impact? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you feel that since the beginning of mass incarceration, has its impact to the communities of color improved or gotten worse?
It's a great question, and I'm not. I guess it depends on how we think of it. I think in this particular moment, what I'm most happy about, most grateful for, is conversations like these, and I guess the momentum building about ending mass incarceration and thinking of it in a very thoughtful, nuanced way. So on the one hand, all of us here in this conversation believe in ending mass incarceration and giving people opportunities, excuse me, for social mobility. I think what I appreciate about this conversation too, though, is that we're talking about all the skills and things that people have been able to cultivate, even while other people think they're locked away and have kind of dismissed them or forgotten about them, that they've still sort of continued to grow and evolve as people, as scholars, as artists, as friends. And so I think that's really powerful. You know, when I was teaching at Wallkill, the building is like a 19th century Gothic building. It's small. You know, Darren was making a great point about cells and cells types and shapes. At Wallkill, they have like tiny dorm rooms. They don't even have cells as such. One of the first things I was struck by when I went in there was just kind of how casually people are walking around. So again, I'm like, it's minimum security. Whereas at Shawangunk, it's like every few stages, the metal bars down and things like that. And Wallkill, he's kind of roaming around, walking around. And there were times in class where I almost forget that I'm in a prison, you know, because it's like they're so smart and they're doing such great work and they're stronger than my NYU students. And, you know, they're talking about their lives and things like that. And in the building we're in, it's so casual and relaxed and in a nice building. And I almost felt like I was teaching at like a black boarding school or something like that, you know? And I think to what extent is a prison like a black boarding school or something like that in moments, right? That you have these, or like a university classroom setting or various things. And other times it's other things. It's awful at times, right? In many ways, you know? And of course, when I leave and when we leave the classroom, I leave the campus and they don't, right? So it's like, it's not to over romanticize it, but I do think that a lot of things are happening in prisons and it's important to make sense of all the things. I mean, one of my students said he was the first person in his family to go to college out of 5 boys. But what he meant was, you know, out of 5 boys, even being incarcerated, he was the first one to take a college class, you know? And that's like a powerful idea, especially since some of my students have gone on from Wallkill to NYU. And actually one of our students was, he had a traffic violation during the height of the pandemic, and it was construed as a parole violation. And they sent him to Rikers Island. He's a graduate student, doing a master's at NYU. They sent him to Rikers Island at the height of the pandemic, Luckily, because of his network, we could get him out. But anyway, all that to say, this is what we're dealing with. But it's a great question. I don't know if I would say it's improved or gotten worse, but I do think what I appreciate is that, let's say, the activism around it has improved, and even the recognition of what people incarcerated themselves are doing inside has improved. Like I think you read some of the recent historiography of incarceration, and now they're talking about like over the decades, people incarcerated representing themselves in legal battles and cases and jailhouse lawyers and things like that. That's really important as well. Just extraordinary research and activism and political legal engagement happening behind bars. So.
I also wanted to say, I wanted to jump in and answer that question as well from James L. And so, because so many things are connected, so policing is connected to mass incarceration, right? Because they make the arrests and then the DAs do the charges. And so, I was having a conversation with Vic LaBoy and Chief Glenn Granitz and two of his captains. And one of the captains said, "Hey, I believe 87% of the police officers in this country that go to work to do a good job." And so he would disagree with all these things about policing, and that policing, like it's just unfair. And I said to him, this is where conversations get uncomfortable, And I said, because I disagree with you. And I said, because it's not the fact that 87% of the police go to work to do a good job. It's the culture of policing that is the problem. And the culture of policing says black and bad is white is good. And that's why, and here's a live example that happened during the pandemic. They were doing a curfew in Georgia, right? And there was a car full of white young people and a car with two black people, all of them college students. And the cops roll up on the black and violently rip them out of the car and arrest them. That speaks to culture. It's not the fact that, I do believe police go to work to do a good job. But when your culture tells you black is bad and white is good, all of that plays a part into mass incarceration. And so I think it is going to get better, but that's because I think we're starting to address the issue of policing and what our culture says ultimately about black and brown people. So I wanted to answer that as well, and say something to that. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Colbert. I have an interesting question here from Mr. Patrick McGee. And it was written a few minutes ago when after we were talking about art a little bit. He says, there's a big question here about what is accepted behavior. And I read that as accepted behavior for clients in prison who may be artists or all. But anyway, it says maybe you could talk about artists and artistic expression and the foundations of the law. Red, maybe this is, well, either of you could answer it, but Dr. Ralph, a question about rights to art. Who has the right to make it? Who has the right to consume it? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. It's a great question, actually, and it's actually I feel like a question, a bigger question even beyond incarceration, because what you see, obviously, art is a reflection of, I would say, wealth in many ways, right? The art industry is linked to how capital moves, in the sense that, like, often people with a lot of money or wealthy estates are the ones controlling art, the value of art, and things like that. Collecting art. Even the judgment of if art is valuable and worth collecting or not. Usually these people are highly educated, often Ivy League trained or trained at elite institutions, who decide what art is meaningful and valuable. And then people who are incarcerated face particular challenges, obviously, even materials, right, to do artwork, right, which are often considered kind of contraband and scarcely available and things like that. But then also the judgment of them, whether they are seen as like trained and skilled artists or something like that. So there are a lot of challenges and problems, but I think what in related kind of dynamic is that even people of color as writers and artists or marginalized people face all kinds of challenges getting to the marketplace. If you notice, like, African writers, usually if a novel or artwork is featured by African artists, the story is one of like post-colonial distress, poverty, famine, war, chaos, mayhem, and that is suffering. That is the narrative of the African novelist or painter. Like, you rarely, and increasingly, thankfully, you do get writers who are working in a kind of speculative mode, sci-fi, things like that. But that's a more recent dynamic or more recent trend by and large. There have been writers like that all the time, but now there's a growing marketplace for that. But often the novelists and artists who are highlighted are telling stories of grief and suffering. And even in the academy, I would say, even among scholars, the ones whose scholarship is most prominent are ones telling stories of grief and suffering, not ones of empowerment, ingenuity, and insight and imagination, or sort of other kinds of stories, more familiar stories. And the same goes obviously for film industry and things like that, which goes back to the unfortunate example that I had, right? But I think even the idea of who can produce certain kinds of art, how to tell certain kinds of stories, what kinds of stories are accurate and valid, these are all kind of political questions, and then also shaped by people with the wealth and the power to make these decisions. So yes, for sure. But I also think art in its relationship to incarceration should be and could be, and in some ways I feel it's becoming a kind of growth industry or something like that. Because I think more and more people are realizing the tremendous artistry and scholarship happening, behind those walls. And so I think that, with conversations like these and people who are willing to kind of engage, I think things could be very different potentially.
Fantastic answer to that question by Mr. Patrick McGee, and seems to me to even enhance the notion that letter writing and the exchange of art between incarcerated people and people outside the prisons is a really important, really important human effort.
It is.
Okay.
Really, I don't know, Ken, I just want to say, I don't know what question you're going to go to next, Michael, but Ken has a very important question, I feel like. Is it okay if we go to that question?
Sure.
So Ken's question is basically about the myth of meritocracy. I think this is so important for many, many reasons. Like, okay, so what I find very distressing is like people I know, like scholars, social scientists, and other people who would seem well educated, right, and unaware and have political concerns and things like that, concerns about equality. This myth is so integral to, I guess, how they see themselves and how they see society. Like I have colleagues who had the pandemic were like, oh, it's tough for students these days, so maybe we'll let students do pass fail. But there should be some way to recognize the efforts of students who are really doing a great job and this and that. And like, what exactly do you mean? We have students who are practically deported, sent back to other countries, working in different time zones, students not at home taking care of their siblings or et cetera, or their parents. People could be sick in their house with COVID. And now we're grading them based on their performance. When we literally, like 1 week at NYU, we were having a conversation. Could you teach online if you had to? Sure, we could do that. Next week, okay, now we're fully remote. Students are packing up, having to move out the dorm. And if they left, the school wants to pack up their stuff and send it, And in the midst of all that, we're now grading them as if it's about how hard you're working in class. And we all know, obviously, that the students who are doing the best, in school and colleges went to the best high schools. They had the PhDs as professors, and their families are wealthy. They can buy all their books and all this stuff. And yet people still want to read the GPA as some sign of how hard you work, how talented you are, how brilliant you are, and all these things. So I think, I always focus on training, like no matter where a student comes from or what they show up, like the question is to measure them from where I encountered them to what they produce later. I'm really interested in the question of training, like how far can you go based on how you were when you showed up? But unfortunately, a lot of it's geared to pedigree and resources and all these things like that are really a marker of sort of wealth, status, and influence.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm going to say all of what Michael said, Dr. Ralph said, absolutely. But I also want to say that it's also like, it seems like it's a rigged system at times, right? And so when you look at it, truly it's a rigged system. It's a rigged system for people. And so I had the wonderful privilege to work with Beth Fritz, who was the chief juvenile probation officer. And she started drawing attention to, wait a minute, something's not right here, the way they sentence young people. Right. And so I had the wonderful privilege to sit in the space of a training. People came from Seattle and did a training for us. And they looked at all of our numbers and drew up numbers. And a juvenile judge said, looking at my statistics based on how I sentence people of color and their white counterparts, my courtroom is racist. That all plays a part. So when you look at, like people are being punished, I think also when you look at someone and demonize them based on their skin color, there is going to be a higher rate of punishment for people like that. And so I think when we just talk about justice, can we just have some equity? If equity starts to happen, I think we're going to see things change. When you stop looking at people of color as these people who are meant to be punished, meant to be all that other stuff, we start looking at them as humans, I think things will change. I really do. So
Yeah,
I'm so
here's,
glad. But Michael, Dr. Ralph did a wonderful job explaining that.
yeah. Yes, thank you, Darian Colbert. Here's a question about the LEAP program from Madison Mitzak. It is, what can students and or the public do to help contribute to the LEAP program or other programs within prisons?
So I'd like to say, so we had a lot of different partners, right? So we had the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM. We had Change on Third, a local organization committed to working with people in addiction. And he used to be the director, Philip Cheney, would come in. So every time we had a class, we did a 5-week class, we had all these partners come in to expose our clients to a better way. We had an entrepreneurship program come in, and we had SHRM, HR managers coming to talk about, hey, resumes today should look like this. This is your format. These are questions. Tell me about a time when you did this. These are, so we had professionals coming in, not only for us to do the training on job readiness and character development, but then HR professionals coming in and say, hey, this is currently what's happening in my world. So make sure you're ready to answer this question, and that question. And so I would also simply say to you, go to your local jail and say, hey, you want to volunteer? You know, is there a program? The LEAP program is still inside of Northampton County Jail. You can go see Chris Gebhardt. I know him personally and say, hey, I want to come in. I want to speak to clients. Can I work in partnership with the LEAP program? You can actually go there and come in and just come in to listen to them. I mean, just coming in to listen to them. If you have questions about, hey, can we talk about that? We can actually kind of build a bridge and bring people in to ask questions, because the reality is they're still human. They're like Dr. Roth was saying. I mean, I had a guy with a Flexi pen, so Mike knows what I'm talking about, and Mike Logan knows the Flexi pen. So he had a Flexi pen. I had pictures he drew me with a Flexi pen that I'm telling you are amazing. And I have them today with me. I call it my smile file, right? Because they write me letters and everything, and I keep it. But the pictures, I mean, I had so many artists draw me pictures, or poetry people. They say, hey, I'm a poet. I do spoken word and I'm a poet. And I say, hey, we're going to talk about this topic. We're going to talk about identity. Can you do a poem on identity? We're talking about friends. Show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Can you do a poem on friends? And I would give them topics, and some of them would spit it freestyle right there in class. But some of them at our graduation celebration would also use their talents of singing, artwork, or poetry, and they would use those skills in that small setting. And the reality is we embraced it and we empowered them to do that. And so, man, there's some amazing people in that realm. So
it's an incredible treasure trove of talent in every prison I've ever heard about. This is going to be the final question, and this is the perennial final question for every panel at this conference, and it's for the panelists and for all of us. But specifically, what can Northampton Community College do, administrators, faculty, students, the entire community, to address the concerns about the prison industrial complex raised by this panel?
I mean, quickly, I think you just start somewhere specific and be humble and listen to people who've been doing it for a long time. I think Darian's advice is great. Like, start locally. And I think, paying attention to what's happening at conferences like these is crucially important, and just kind of making yourself aware, get on social media and follow who's doing this important work and stuff like that. But you could just start locally, like literally wherever the closest correctional facility is, what kind of program, what opportunities to volunteer are there, or, local schools. I just think a little bit goes a long way. You might be there for a few hours on a few weeks and really change someone's life or connect someone to some other possibilities, and that itself is amazing.
Yeah, so I would encourage them. So Lafayette College comes in, they go into Northampton County Jail, and they do an inside out program. And what they do is they do a class within the prison, right? And they come into the prison, and this whole class that they get graded on, they work with, so it's a women's program, but they work with women on A2S and CCF3, and they sit in that space and they do a class together. And I just think on Northampton County, that would be cool for you guys to also pilot a program there, which I think you guys are already working on doing, getting into Northampton County Jail, but I also encourage you to get in Lehigh County Jail and just pilot a program where you're actually doing a class in there, because there are some amazing, smart people in there. And I love what some of when I went to the graduation, all of the students said this was one of the most amazing experiences, because you get to see people as they really are. They are human with power, and you get to engage and connect with people like that. And that really is revolutionary when you do that, because everyone has their perceptions of prison, right? And you go in there and then they're like, oh my goodness, this was amazing. So I would encourage you to engage that way, but also continue doing this Peace and Social Justice Conference. I think this is the 14th year. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, that you guys have been doing this. You got to continue this. And I believe Shanta was on, I'm not sure if she's still on here, but I always talk about courageous conversations, right? And we've been having courageous conversations for over 30 years. We need to move from courageous conversations to courageous relationships to courageous action. And I think that's the trajectory we should take. So it's cool to have a courageous conversation, but what does that look like afterwards? Can we have a courageous relationship where we're being honest? And then can we move into courageous action, which is going into a prison and volunteering and doing things of that nature? So that's what I would say.
I'm gonna jump on real quick.
Okay.
I just want to thank Darian so much for coming out for this. Thank you, Michael Ralph, so much for coming on. This is super enlightening. Michael, thank you so much for another amazing job moderating. I'd like to invite everybody to stick around. We've got a lot more going on today. The NAACP is up next, I believe. We've got programming going on throughout the rest of the day. We've got the lounge, we've got the lobby if you want to continue any of these conversations. And we also have a whole day of events going on tomorrow. As far as continuing this, yeah, we've been having a lot of conversations about keeping this website open. And there's no reason why, you know, we have it. So this is a space and a lot of people know it. And so we're thinking about maybe starting to gather once a month and continue to have conversations. And
Awesome.
so we're really excited. So thank you again so much for
all of you. It's amazing. It's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So much more to talk about. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks,
Mike.
Bye-bye.
Both Mikes.
Thanks, Darian and Michael and Ken.